Unaware he's the son of the secret trillionaire who died few days ago, his wife divorced him to marry his best friend, unaware he inherit trillion-dollar real estate empire and the company she worked for. What he did shock her and left her shattered. The divorce papers trembled in Daniel Morrison's calloused hands as his wife of 7 years, Victoria, stood in their cramped apartment with his best friend since college, Brandon Pierce, their fingers intertwined with an intimacy that suggested this betrayal had been brewing for months. Daniel had spent the last decade working double shifts as a warehouse supervisor, barely scraping by while Victoria climbed the corporate ladder at Pierce Global Enterprises, one of the most prestigious real estate conglomerates in the nation. But what she didn't know was that the company stamping her paychecks, the empire she worshipped, the billion-dollar corporation she pledged her loyalty to, would soon belong to the man she was discarding like yesterday's trash. 3 days earlier, across the country in a private hospital wing that cost more per night than Daniel earned in a year, a man named Jonathan Pierce, no relation to Brandon, but rather the reclusive billionaire whose name appeared on exactly 0 Forbes lists, whose face was unknown to the public, whose wealth was hidden behind shell corporations and offshore accounts, had taken his final breath, but not before his attorney located the son he'd abandoned 33 years ago, the child he'd left behind to protect from the deadly power struggles that had claimed 3 of his other heirs. The sealed envelope sitting in Daniel's work locker, delivered by a silver-haired lawyer who seemed to know Daniel's every movement, contained documents that would transform the struggling warehouse worker into the sole beneficiary of a fortune so vast it included luxury hotels in 53 countries, commercial real estate holdings across 6 continents, and a controlling stake in Pierce Global Enterprises, the very company currently employing his soon-to-be ex-wife as a senior vice president. Victoria had called him a failure, a disappointment, an anchor dragging down her ambitions, but she had no idea that the quiet man who never complained about her late nights at the office, who supported her career while sacrificing his own education, who loved her despite her growing contempt, was about to become her ultimate boss and the owner of everything she'd worked for. Brandon smirking with the confidence of a man who believed he'd won, who thought stealing his best friend's wife was the ultimate victory, who had been secretly positioning himself to propose to Victoria the moment the divorce was final, had spent years manipulating both of them, but he couldn't have known that his cruel triumph would transform into his complete destruction within 48 hours. The question burning through the walls of that shabby apartment wasn't whether Daniel would sign the papers ending his marriage. It was what he would do with the power about to fall into his hands, how he would wield a trillion-dollar empire against those who betrayed him, and whether the wife who abandoned him and the best friend who stole her would survive the shock of discovering who Daniel Morrison really was. Would Victoria's ambition survive the revelation that she'd divorced her way out of unimaginable wealth? Would Brandon's betrayal crumble when he realized he'd destroyed the one person who stood between him and absolute corporate annihilation? Would Daniel choose mercy or revenge when the truth finally shattered their worlds? Daniel Morrison's Thursday had started the way every Thursday had started for the past 7 years, with the metallic screech of the alarm clock at 4:47 a.m., and Victoria's irritated groan from the other side of their queen-sized bed. But this Thursday carried a weight he couldn't quite name, a heaviness in his chest that felt like premonition wrapped in dread. The apartment they shared in downtown Seattle was modest, a 2-bedroom unit in a building that had seen better decades, but Daniel had always tried to make it feel like home, even as Victoria's complaints grew louder with each passing year. She wanted a penthouse view, a doorman, an address that matched her rising position at Pierce Global Enterprises. But Daniel's salary as a warehouse supervisor barely covered their current rent, and his attempts to save money were constantly undermined by Victoria's increasingly expensive tastes. "I'm meeting Brandon," couldn't give voice to the betrayal that had been living in his peripheral vision for months. Jesus, Danny. Tommy's hand landed on his shoulder, solid and grounding. What are you going to do? Before Daniel could answer, before he could admit that he had absolutely no idea how to navigate the implosion of his entire life, his name echoed across the warehouse's PA system. Daniel Morrison, please report to the main office. Daniel Morrison to the main office. The walk across the warehouse floor felt surreal because Daniel Morrison never got called to the main office. In 7 years, he'd received exactly 3 pieces of company correspondence, all of them about minor adjustments to his health insurance. Workers turned to watch his progress, curiosity plain on their faces. But Daniel kept his eyes forward, his mind spinning through possibilities ranging from sudden termination to some administrative error with his paycheck. The main office was a climate-controlled space that felt like a different world from the warehouse floor, carpeted and professional, decorated with motivational posters about teamwork and efficiency. But the atmosphere today felt strange, charged with an energy Daniel couldn't identify. His supervisor, Greg Matheson, stood outside the conference room with an expression Daniel had never seen before, something between confusion and concern, but also a new kind of respect that seemed utterly misplaced. Morrison, there's someone here to see you. He's been waiting for an hour. Who? He didn't say, just that it was urgent and personal. Greg lowered his voice, his usual condescension replaced by something that sounded like awe. The guy came in a car that probably costs more than this whole building, man. What's going on? Daniel had no answer, but he pushed open the conference room door to find a man in his 60s sitting at the cheap folding table, looking completely out of place in his obviously custom-tailored charcoal suit. The man's silver hair was perfectly styled. His posture spoke of generations of privilege, and his eyes, sharp, assessing, kind, studied Daniel with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. Mr. Morrison, the man said, rising to extend his hand. My name is Richard Ashford. I'm the senior partner at Ashford, Wellington & Associates. We handle estate matters for high net worth individuals and families. Please sit down. What I have to tell you will require a moment to process. Daniel shook the offered hand, noting the watch on Richard's wrist that probably cost more than a year of his salary, but his mind was blank with confusion. I think you have the wrong person. I don't know anyone with money. My parents died when I was 3. Car accident. I grew up in foster care. Yes, I know. Richard's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. Your mother, Jennifer Morrison, died alongside her husband in that accident on Interstate 90 outside of Spokane. But Jennifer Morrison wasn't your biological mother, Daniel. She was your adoptive mother, though the adoption had only been finalized 6 months before the accident. The words made no sense, created no coherent picture in Daniel's mind, but Richard continued, his voice gentle but firm, like a surgeon cutting away dead tissue to expose what lay beneath. Your biological father was a man named Jonathan Pierce. He died 3 days ago in a private medical facility in Manhattan, and he spent the last 6 months of his life searching for you. Jonathan Pierce, Daniel repeated the name, tasting each syllable, searching for any flicker of recognition, but found only emptiness. I don't understand. Why would he give me up? Why now? Richard opened a leather portfolio, the kind that whispered money in every stitch, and extracted a letter written on heavy cardstock that felt expensive even before Daniel touched it. Perhaps this will explain better than I can. He wrote this 2 weeks before he died, when he knew his time was short. He wanted you to hear his words directly, but I'll summarize the key points first, because the full context is substantial. Daniel took the letter with hands that trembled slightly, but Richard held up a hand. Before you read that, Mr. Morrison, I need to explain what you're inheriting. Jonathan Pierce was worth approximately $1.3 trillion. The number was so large it lost meaning, became abstract, became a joke that Daniel's exhausted brain couldn't properly process. But Richard wasn't smiling. "Trillion," Daniel repeated stupidly. That's not possible. That's more than most countries." Jonathan Pierce was not a public figure. He carefully structured his holdings through layers of private corporations, offshore accounts, and trust arrangements that kept his name out of any wealth rankings. He owned real estate on 6 continents, hotels, commercial properties, residential developments. He had controlling stakes in dozens of multinational corporations, including Pierce Global Enterprises, the 6th largest real estate conglomeration in North America. The room tilted slightly, Daniel's vision narrowing as his brain tried to reconcile warehouse supervisor with trillion-dollar heir, but the pieces wouldn't fit. The reality wouldn't compute. "Pierce Global Enterprises, that's where my wife works." "Yes." Richard's expression became carefully neutral. "Victoria Morrison, née Hartley, is a senior vice president in their acquisitions division. Her employment file shows she's been with the company for 6 years, currently earning $287,000 annually, plus performance bonuses. She's quite successful. There." Something cold settled in Daniel's stomach, a weight that felt like premonition mixed with dread. Why did he give me up? Why did he find me now? Richard's face aged a decade in the space of a breath. Jonathan Pierce had 7 children by 4 different women across 35 years. 3 of those children died in what were eventually revealed to be orchestrated accidents, murdered by rivals who wanted to destabilize his holdings, or by internal family members who wanted to secure their own inheritances. When you were born, Jonathan was in the middle of a brutal corporate war that had already claimed his oldest son. He made the agonizing decision to place you in a closed adoption, to erase your connection to him completely, to give you the one thing he couldn't give his other children, safety through anonymity. The letter in Daniel's hands suddenly felt heavier, carried the weight of decades of absence and impossible choices, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to read it yet. The other children, what happened to them? Of the 4 surviving children, 2 have been effectively bought out of their inheritances. They received substantial sums to waive all claims to the estate. The remaining 2 are currently contesting the will, but Jonathan's legal arrangements were ironclad, and they anticipated every possible challenge. You, Daniel Morrison, are the sole beneficiary of the primary estate. Everything else was divided or sold off, but the core, the trillion-dollar empire that includes Pierce Global Enterprises and approximately 800 other corporate entities, belongs to you. Daniel's laugh was sharp, edged with hysteria that bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest. "This is insane. I'm a warehouse worker. I don't know anything about running corporations or managing real estate empires. There has to be some mistake." "There's no mistake." Richard pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures that looked legitimate enough to be terrifying. "Jonathan spent 6 months vetting you, Daniel. He had investigators looking into your life, your choices, your character. Do you know what they found? A man who worked 2 jobs to put his wife through graduate school. A man who never complained when she succeeded while he stayed behind. A man who kept his word, who treated his co-workers with respect, who endured mockery from his supervisor without retaliating. Jonathan wrote in his final letters that you were exactly what he hoped you'd become, someone who understood struggle, who knew the value of loyalty, who hadn't been corrupted by wealth or entitlement. The words should have felt like validation, should have filled some hollow space inside Daniel's chest, but instead they just created more questions, more confusion, more sense of everything he'd known becoming unmoored. When does this happen? When do I inherit? The estate cleared probate yesterday morning, as of 9 a.m. Pacific time today. You became the legal owner of these assets. The transition will take months to fully implement, but effective immediately. You have access to accounts containing approximately $43 billion in liquid assets for operational purposes, but the bulk of the estate is held in properties, corporate shares, and long-term investments. $43 billion. Daniel's mind couldn't even create an image around that number, couldn't conceptualize what that kind of money looked like or meant. But his thoughts kept circling back to Victoria, to Brandon, to the divorce papers she'd probably already drafted, to the life that was dissolving even as a new one was being thrust upon him. "Mr. Morrison," Richard said gently, "I know this is overwhelming. I've arranged for a support team, financial advisors, corporate strategists, personal security, legal counsel, to help you navigate this transition. But there's one more thing you need to know. Something that requires an immediate decision." Daniel looked up from the letter he still hadn't read, his eyes burning with unshed tears he didn't fully understand. "What?" "Your wife filed for divorce this morning. The papers were served to this address 2 hours ago, which is why I knew to find you here. But the filing went through her law firm, which is retained by Pierce Global Enterprises. She's citing irreconcilable differences and requesting an equitable division of assets, which, given your previous financial situation, would be minimal. However, given your new circumstances, you need to decide how to proceed. Do you sign the papers, or do you contest?" The question hung in the climate-controlled air of the conference room, weighted with implications Daniel's exhausted brain could barely process. But somewhere beneath the shock and confusion, a deeper part of him, the part that had endured 7 years of growing contempt, had smiled through countless small cruelties, had loved someone who'd stopped loving him back, began to wake up. "What does Victoria know?" Daniel asked quietly. "Nothing. The estate matters have been handled with absolute confidentiality. Even her employer doesn't yet know that ownership has transferred. That information will be revealed during the quarterly board meeting, which is scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m., but you could expedite or delay that announcement as you see fit." Daniel stood, his legs unsteady but holding, his mind beginning to clear as the initial shock gave way to something sharper, something that felt like pieces of a puzzle starting to align. "I need to think. I need to read this letter. I need to—" He stopped because he had no idea what he needed, no framework for processing any of this. "Of course." Richard stood as well, extracting a business card and a small black card that looked like metal. "The business card has my direct line and my personal cell. Call anytime, day or night. The other card is connected to an account with $50 million for your immediate personal use. The PIN is 1117, your birth date in month and day format. I've also taken the liberty of reserving a suite at the Belmont Grand Hotel downtown, one of your properties under the name Richard Ashford, to maintain your privacy. Whether you use it or return to your apartment is entirely your choice, but you now have options, Mr. Morrison, more options than most people could imagine in a lifetime." Daniel pocketed both cards, the weight of them feeling both real and completely surreal, but his hands were steadier now, his breathing more controlled. "The divorce papers, when do I have to respond?" "Washington state law gives you 20 days to file a response, but I'd recommend you take at least 48 hours to think carefully about your next steps. This is not just about your marriage, Daniel. It's about how you want to step into this new life, who you want to become, and how you want to wield the power you've inherited." The word power landed differently than all the talk of money and assets, because power was something Daniel had never possessed, something Victoria and Brandon had used against him, something that was now his to use or refuse, but he had no idea which path to choose. He left the conference room in a daze, walked back across the warehouse floor where his co-workers pretended not to stare, and found Tommy Chen waiting by his locker, with concern carved deep in the lines around his eyes. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Something like that, Daniel managed, but his voice sounded strange to his own ears, detached and floating. He opened his locker to grab his jacket and found the sealed envelope that Richard must have mentioned. The letter from Jonathan Pierce, his biological father, the secret trillionaire whose blood ran in Daniel's veins, but whose face Daniel wouldn't recognize on the street. "You need to take the rest of the day?" Tommy asked. "I can cover your shift, man. You look rough." Daniel almost said yes, almost fled to the hotel suite or his apartment or anywhere that wasn't here, but then his phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Having dinner with Brandon tonight. Don't wait up. We need to talk this weekend about our situation. Time to stop delaying the inevitable." The words were cold, dismissive, already positioning herself as the victim of Daniel's inadequacy, rather than the architect of betrayal. But beneath his hurt, beneath the exhaustion and confusion, something else stirred, something that recognized this moment as a crossroads, a point where passive acceptance could give way to active choice. "Actually," Daniel said slowly, "I think I'm going to stay, finish my shift, maybe work some overtime tonight. I've got some thinking to do, and sometimes the best thinking happens when your hands are busy." Tommy clapped him on the shoulder, pride and concern mixing in his expression. "That's the spirit, brother. Whatever's going on, you'll get through it. You always do." But as Daniel returned to the warehouse floor, his mind wasn't on conveyor belts or inventory counts. It was on the letter burning a hole in his jacket pocket, on the black card that represented more money than he'd earned in his entire life, on Victoria and Brandon sharing intimate dinners while planning their future together, completely unaware that the failure they were discarding was about to become the most powerful person in their world. The evening shift passed in a blur of physical labor and racing thoughts, Daniel's body moving on autopilot while his mind spun through scenarios and possibilities. But he waited until he was alone in his car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and 187,000 miles on the odometer, before he finally opened the letter from Jonathan Pierce. The handwriting was shaky but legible, carrying the weight of a dying man's final words. "Daniel, I don't have the right to call you son, not after 33 years of absence, not after choosing to protect you by abandoning you. But I hope you'll read these words with an open mind and perhaps, someday, with forgiveness. When your mother, your biological mother, Catherine, told me she was pregnant, I was in the middle of a war. Not a metaphorical business battle, but an actual war for survival against people who wanted to destroy everything I'd built and everyone I loved. My oldest son, Michael, had died 3 months earlier, in what police called an accident, but what I knew was murder. My daughter, Elena, was receiving death threats. The people close to me were targets, pawns in a game played by rivals and family members who saw my empire as something to be carved up and claimed. Catherine and I weren't married, weren't even in a relationship that could survive the scrutiny my enemies would bring. But I loved you before you were born. I loved you enough to make the hardest choice of my life. I paid for a closed adoption, erased your connection to me, gave you to Jennifer and Robert Morrison, who were good people, stable people, people who would love you without the target my name would have painted on your back. I told myself it was temporary, that once the threats subsided, once I'd secured my holdings and neutralized my enemies, I'd find you and reveal the truth. But the threats never fully subsided. The enemies multiplied and the years turned into decades. By the time I realized I was dying, by the time I understood that my time to make amends was running out, you'd built a life without me, without my money, without the poison that comes with this kind of wealth. My investigators told me everything, Daniel. They told me about Victoria, about the way she treats you, about Brandon's betrayal. They told me you work 60-hour weeks to support a wife who looks down on you, that you've sacrificed your own dreams to enable hers, that you've endured mockery and contempt. without complaint. Part of me wanted to intervene immediately, wanted to use my resources to expose them both, to punish them for hurting my son. But Richard convinced me that you needed to make your own choices, that swooping in as a savior would rob you of something essential. So instead, I'm giving you tools. I'm giving you the empire I built, the wealth I accumulated, the power I wielded for 5 decades. But what you do with it, whether you use it for revenge or mercy, whether you become like me or forge a different path, is entirely your decision. The company Victoria works for is yours. The apartment Brandon lives in, a luxury penthouse he bought with loans he can barely afford, sits in a building you now own. The social circles they move in, the world they worship, the money they chase, it all flows through systems you now control. But here's what I learned too late. Power without purpose becomes poison. Wealth without wisdom becomes waste, and revenge without resolution becomes a prison. You can destroy them both, Daniel, and part of me hopes you will. But I also hope you'll consider whether destruction is what you really want, or if there's something more important you could build with this opportunity. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry you grew up without a father, without the resources that were your birthright, without the protection my name might have provided, but I'm also grateful that you became someone good, someone decent, someone who understands what it means to struggle. That's worth more than any inheritance I could leave. Be better than I was. Be wiser than I could be. And if you can find it in yourself to forgive me, know that my last thoughts were of you, of the son I loved enough to let go, of the man I hoped you'd become. Your father, Jonathan Daniel, read the letter 3 times, sitting in his aging car in the warehouse parking lot as the evening shift changed and workers streamed past, their faces tired and honest, their lives uncomplicated by trillion-dollar inheritances and dying fathers' confessions. But each reading revealed new layers, new implications, new choices that felt impossible to navigate. The city lights of Seattle glowed against the darkening sky, familiar and alien all at once, because Daniel was seeing his world through different eyes now, not as a struggling warehouse worker trapped in a failing marriage, but as someone with the power to reshape reality, to rewrite the rules, to become either savior or destroyer. His phone buzzed again, another text from Victoria. Actually, might stay at Brandon's tonight. His place is so much nicer than ours. No point coming home to that depressing apartment when I don't have to. See you Saturday for the talk. The casual cruelty of it, the thoughtless dismissal, the assumption that Daniel would simply accept this as his reality, sparked something in his chest that felt like anger mixed with clarity. But beneath both emotions was a deeper question. What kind of man did he want to be with this power? Daniel started the car, the engine coughing before settling into its familiar rough idle, but instead of driving to the empty apartment or the luxury hotel suite, he found himself heading toward the building where Brandon lived, a sleek high-rise in Belltown with a doorman and a view of Elliott Bay, a place that had always made Daniel feel small and inadequate whenever he'd visited, but which, according to Jonathan's letter, now technically belonged to him. He parked across the street, his old Honda looking absurdly out of place among the Teslas and BMWs, and watched the building's entrance as expensive-looking people came and went, but he wasn't sure what he was looking for, what he hoped to see or understand by being there. Then he saw them, Victoria and Brandon, emerging from a black Mercedes with their arms around each other, laughing at some private joke, her head on his shoulder in a pose of intimate comfort that felt like a knife between Daniel's ribs. But there was something else in their body language, something triumphant and smug, that suggested they weren't just lovers but conspirators, people who believed they'd successfully pulled off some great deception. Daniel watched them disappear into the building, watched the doorman, his doorman, if Richard was telling the truth, greet them with professional warmth, watched the elevator lights climb to what he knew was the penthouse floor, and felt something shift in his chest, something that felt like the final death of who he'd been and the painful birth of who he might become. He pulled out his phone and called the number on Richard Ashford's card, and the lawyer answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "Mr. Morrison, have you made any decisions?" "Not yet," Daniel admitted, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I need to know something. The board meeting Monday morning at Pierce Global Enterprises, who attends?" "The board of directors, C-suite executives, and department heads. Approximately 47 people total, including your wife, who attends as the senior VP of acquisitions, but Brandon Pierce is not employed by the company, if that's what you're wondering." "No, I know that. Brandon works in tech sales for a different company, but Victoria, she'll be there when they announce the ownership change?" "Yes, the announcement is mandatory under the corporate bylaws. Any change in controlling ownership must be disclosed to the board and executive leadership immediately, but we've been holding off until Monday to give you time to prepare." Daniel closed his eyes, seeing the scene in his mind. Victoria in her power suit, confident and dismissive of the poor husband she was leaving behind, sitting in a conference room with her colleagues when the news broke that Daniel Morrison, warehouse worker and soon-to-be ex-husband, was actually the owner of everything she'd worked for, everything she valued, everything she'd sacrificed her marriage to achieve. "I want to be there," Daniel said quietly. "I want to attend the meeting. Can you arrange that?" There was a pause on the line, pregnant with implications. "Yes, I can arrange that. But Mr. Morrison, Daniel, I need you to think carefully about what you're planning. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it can also consume you, can turn you into something you don't want to become. And trust me when I say I've seen what inherited wealth does to people's souls." "This isn't about revenge," Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "It's about understanding. I need to see her face when she realizes what she's lost, what she threw away, what she chose over me, but I also need to see who I become in that moment, whether I turn into someone bitter and cruel, or whether I can find some other way to be." "Fair enough." Richard's voice warmed with something that might have been approval or might have been concern. "I'll have you added to the meeting agenda as a special guest. The announcement will come from me as the estate attorney, and then I'll introduce you as the new owner. I'd suggest you dress appropriately, not because you need to impress anyone, but because showing up in warehouse clothes sends one message, while showing up in a suit sends another, and you need to decide which message you want to send." "I don't own a suit," Daniel admitted. "Never had a reason to buy one." "I'll have a tailor at your hotel suite tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. They'll bring several options and can make any necessary alterations by Sunday evening. I'll also arrange for a stylist if you'd like help with the overall presentation, but that's optional." The surrealism of the conversation, casually discussing personal tailors and stylists while sitting in a beaten-up Honda, would have been funny if it weren't so disorienting, but Daniel was learning to accept the disconnect between his old reality and his new one. "Okay, thank you, Richard." "One more thing, Daniel. The divorce papers. What do you want to do about them?" Daniel looked up at the penthouse windows, imagining Victoria and Brandon celebrating their victory, toasting their successful betrayal, planning a future built on the wreckage of Daniel's trust, but he still didn't have an answer. "I'll let you know after the meeting. I need to see who I am with this power before I decide how to use it." He ended the call and sat in the dark car for another hour, watching the lights of Seattle shimmer across the bay, watching people live their normal lives in the building he apparently owned, watching the city that had always felt like home become strange and foreign, but eventually the cold seeped through his inadequate jacket and drove him back to the apartment he'd shared with Victoria for 7 years. The place felt different now, smaller and shabbier, but also like a museum exhibit of who he used to be, the cheap furniture they'd bought at discount stores, the walls that needed painting but that Victoria had never bothered to approve, the photos from happier times that now felt like evidence of an elaborate con rather than genuine memories. He found the divorce papers on the kitchen counter, left there with Victoria's typical thoughtlessness, her assumption that he'd sign them without protest or negotiation, her certainty that Daniel Morrison was too weak and too broken to fight back. But the papers now read differently, the asset division laughably inadequate given what Daniel actually owned. Instead of signing them, instead of accepting defeat, Daniel left them on the counter and went to the bedroom he'd shared with his wife. But he didn't sleep. He lay awake all night reading articles about Jonathan Pierce on his phone, piecing together the public fragments of a life deliberately kept private, learning about the empire he'd inherited and the father he'd never known. By dawn, Daniel had made a decision, though whether it was the right one, whether it would lead to healing or destruction, whether it would make him a better man or a worse one, remained to be seen. But at least it was his decision, his choice to make with eyes open and awareness of consequences. Saturday passed in a surreal blur, the hotel suite that was larger than his apartment and came with a view that probably cost more per night than his monthly rent. The tailor who brought suits that felt like wearing liquid confidence, the stylist who shaped his hair and taught him small adjustments to posture and presence that changed how he looked in the mirror, from defeated to determined. But beneath the surface transformation, Daniel remained fundamentally himself, fundamentally uncertain, fundamentally terrified of what Monday would bring. Victoria called Saturday afternoon, her voice bright with false cheer. "Hey, so Brandon and I were thinking, why drag this out? Let's meet tomorrow, sign the papers, get everything filed by Monday, clean break, you know? I've been thinking about what you said about us growing apart, and I agree, it's best for both of us to move on." The lie was so casual, so confident, so utterly convinced of Daniel's compliance that he almost laughed. But instead, he kept his voice neutral. "Tomorrow doesn't work for me. I have some things I need to handle. Can we do Tuesday instead?" There was a pause, and he could hear Brandon's voice in the background asking what Daniel had said. "Tuesday? That's 4 days away, Daniel. Don't be difficult about this. We're trying to be mature and amicable." "Tuesday," he repeated firmly, "after 5 p.m. I'll call you Monday night to confirm the location." He hung up before she could argue, felt a small surge of satisfaction at asserting even that tiny bit of control, but the satisfaction was immediately swallowed by renewed anxiety about Monday's board meeting, about the revelation that would either liberate him or destroy him, about the man he might become when he stopped being the victim of his own story. Sunday was worse, endless hours of rehearsing what he might say, imagining Victoria's reaction, playing out scenarios that ranged from her immediate contrition to her complete denial of wrongdoing. But every imagined scene felt false, felt insufficient to the reality of what was actually happening, felt like trying to prepare for an earthquake by studying architectural diagrams. By Sunday night, Daniel had cycled through every possible emotion. Rage at the betrayal, grief for the marriage he'd believed in, fear of the power he now held, excitement at possibilities he'd never imagined, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from 7 years of trying to be enough for someone who'd decided he never would be. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his hotel suite, his hotel, one of hundreds he apparently owned, and looked out at the city lights, at the buildings that housed his properties, at the corporations that now operated under his ownership, at the vast invisible web of wealth and power that had been thrust upon him. But he couldn't see himself in any of it yet, couldn't reconcile warehouse worker Daniel with empire owner Daniel. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Car will pick you up at 8:15 a.m. Meeting starts at 9. You'll wait in an adjacent office until I introduce you. Remember, you don't have to decide everything tomorrow. You're just meeting your new reality. How you shape it comes later." The advice was sound, but Daniel's hands still trembled as he typed back, "Thank you for everything. See you tomorrow. Sleep was impossible, so Daniel spent the night reading through corporate documents Richard had provided. Organizational charts showing hundreds of companies under the Pierce umbrella, financial statements that made his head spin with numbers that seemed meaningless in their magnitude, employee directories that included Victoria's name and title and salary, making real what had previously been abstract. At 7 a.m., Daniel showered and dressed in the navy suit the tailor had altered to perfection, the Italian leather shoes that felt like walking on clouds, the watch that cost more than his car, the overall presentation that transformed him from invisible warehouse worker into someone who commanded attention, but the face in the mirror still belonged to Daniel Morrison, still carried the hurt of betrayal, still questioned whether he deserved any of this. The car that arrived at 8:15 was a Mercedes S-Class, with a driver named James who greeted Daniel with professional warmth but no questions, and the ride to Pierce Global Enterprises headquarters took 20 minutes through Monday morning Seattle traffic, but every minute felt like an hour. Every block brought Daniel closer to a moment that would irrevocably change everything. The Pierce Global building was a 40-story glass and steel monument to corporate success in the heart of downtown, and Daniel had visited exactly twice before. Once to bring Victoria her forgotten laptop, once to meet her for a lunch that she'd canceled at the last minute. But both times he'd felt like an intruder, a person who didn't belong in spaces of polished marble and designer furniture. Today, walking through the lobby with Richard Ashford at his side, Daniel felt different, not confident exactly, but purposeful, a man walking toward his destiny rather than fleeing from his failure. But his hands still trembled slightly as they entered the private elevator that rose directly to the executive floor. Victoria will be in the main conference room with the rest of the board, Richard explained as they rode up in uncomfortable silence. The meeting follows a standard agenda: quarterly results, upcoming projects, strategic initiatives, and the ownership announcement is item 7, approximately 45 minutes in, but we can adjust timing if you need more or less time to prepare. 45 minutes is fine, Daniel said, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears, tight and controlled. I'll be ready. The elevator opened onto the executive floor, all floor-to-ceiling windows and art that probably cost more than Daniel's childhood home, and Richard led him to a small office adjacent to the main conference room, a space clearly designed for private conversations or pre-meeting preparations, but which now served as Daniel's holding cell while he waited for his life to either begin or end. Through the office's interior window, one-way glass, Richard explained, Daniel could see into the conference room where Pierce Global's leadership was gathering, and there she was, Victoria, resplendent in a burgundy power suit that Daniel had never seen before, her hair professionally styled, her makeup perfect, her bearing confident and assured as she chatted with colleagues and laughed at jokes Daniel couldn't hear. She looked happy, looked free, looked like someone who'd successfully escaped something limiting rather than destroyed something precious. But Daniel couldn't look away, couldn't stop cataloging every gesture, every smile, every moment of contentment that existed, because she'd chosen Brandon over him, chosen ambition over loyalty, chosen cruelty over kindness. Brandon wasn't there. He had no reason to be. No role in this company, no connection to Pierce Global beyond being Victoria's secret lover and Daniel's former friend, and Daniel felt a strange disappointment at that, because part of him wanted Brandon to witness this moment too, wanted both betrayers present for the revelation of consequences. The meeting started exactly at 9 a.m., and Daniel watched through the one-way glass as the CEO, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Winters, who Daniel recognized from company newsletters, called the board to order and began working through the agenda with efficient professionalism. Quarterly results were strong. Upcoming projects looked promising. Strategic initiatives were approved with minimal discussion. Victoria contributed to several conversations, her voice clear and confident even through the glass, her expertise evident in the way other board members deferred to her analysis, her success undeniable even to Daniel's wounded heart. Then came agenda item 7, and Patricia's expression shifted to something more serious. Before we move forward, I need to address an unusual situation. As many of you know, the Pierce family has owned a controlling stake in this company for over 30 years, though they've maintained a deliberately low profile. But the death of Jonathan Pierce 3 months ago triggered succession provisions that we've been working through with the estate attorneys. 3 months ago, Daniel thought. He'd been dying for 3 months, while I went to work every day, while Victoria planned her betrayal, while my entire life was a lie I didn't know I was living. Patricia continued, her voice carrying weight that silenced all sidebar conversations. The estate has now cleared probate and we have a new owner. Mr. Richard Ashford, senior partner at Ashford, Wellington and Associates, is here to make the formal announcement and introduction. Richard? Richard stood from his position at the side of the room, commanding immediate attention with his presence and authority. But he first caught Daniel's eye through the one-way glass, a silent question. "Are you ready?" Daniel nodded, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. His hands clenched into fists to hide their trembling, his entire being focused on Victoria's face as Richard began to speak. "Thank you, Patricia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to announce that Pierce Global Enterprises and all associated holdings are now owned by Mr. Daniel Morrison, the sole heir of Jonathan Pierce's estate. But before I bring Mr. Morrison in to address the board, I want to provide some context that will help you understand the unique circumstances of this transition." Victoria's head snapped up at the name, her face going through a rapid sequence of expressions. Confusion, disbelief, shock, horror, each one playing across her features like watching someone fall in slow motion, but she didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just stared at Richard with an expression that Daniel had never seen before, something between panic and rage. Richard continued, his voice measured and professional. "Mr. Morrison has spent his entire adult life unaware of his connection to Jonathan Pierce. He grew up in foster care, worked his way through various jobs, and has been employed as a warehouse supervisor for the past 7 years while supporting his wife, who, as it happens, is seated at this table through her graduate education and subsequent rise through this company's ranks." Now the other board members were following Richard's gaze, turning to look at Victoria, whose face had gone chalk white, whose hands gripped the conference table edge like it was the only thing keeping her from falling, whose eyes had gone wide with an emotion Daniel couldn't quite name but which looked something like existential terror. "Mr. Morrison learned of his inheritance only 4 days ago," Richard said. "He spent the weekend considering how to move forward, how to step into this role, how to navigate the complex personal and professional dynamics that his new position creates. But he wanted to introduce himself to this board personally, wanted to meet the people who've built this company, wanted to understand the business he now owns before making any decisions about leadership or direction." Richard walked to the door of the adjacent office, opened it with theatrical timing, and gestured for Daniel to enter. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Mr. Daniel Morrison, owner of Pierce Global Enterprises and approximately 800 other corporate entities, comprising a $1.3 trillion estate." Daniel walked into the conference room on legs that felt like water, his suit armor against the stares of 47 people he'd never met, his expression carefully neutral even as his eyes found Victoria's and held them with an intensity that felt like pouring years of hurt and betrayal into a single look. The room was absolutely silent, every person frozen in various states of shock or curiosity, but Daniel only had eyes for his wife, for the woman who'd planned to divorce him in 4 days, who'd already moved on with his best friend, who'd called him a failure and an anchor, who was now understanding. Daniel could see the realization dawning in her eyes like watching the sun rise over a landscape of disaster. exactly what she'd thrown away. "Good morning," Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm Daniel Morrison, and I imagine my name is familiar to at least one person in this room. Before we discuss business, before we talk about the future of this company, before we address any concerns you might have about change in ownership, I want to share a little about my journey to this moment, because I think context matters." He pulled out a chair at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the owner, though Daniel had never known that until Richard briefed him, and sat down with deliberate care, his movements controlled even as his heart raced. 4 days ago, I was working my regular shift at Morrison Logistics, a warehouse on the south side of Seattle. I was earning about $47,000 a year before overtime, living in a modest apartment, driving a 15-year-old Honda with 187,000 miles on it, but I thought I had a pretty good life. I had a job I was decent at, co-workers who respected me, a wife I loved who seemed to be succeeding in her career here at Pierce Global, and a best friend I'd known since college, but it turns out I was wrong about some of those things. Victoria made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, but Daniel didn't look away from her face, didn't soften his words or his expression. That same morning, my wife filed for divorce, not because I'd done anything wrong, not because we'd fought or grown apart in any dramatic way, but because, and I'm quoting her exact words here, she was tired of coming home to a dump, tired of looking at me in my pathetic work clothes, tired of explaining to her successful colleagues that her husband pushed boxes around a warehouse. But what my wife didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while she was filing those papers and planning her exit strategy with my best friend, I was learning that I'd inherited a fortune so vast that this company, the company she's devoted 6 years of her life to, the company that validates her identity and her success, was now mine. Several board members turned to stare at Victoria, who had tears streaming down her face, but who remained utterly still, frozen in her chair like a defendant awaiting sentencing. But Daniel kept his tone even, factual, letting the story speak for itself without embellishment or rage. I spent the weekend thinking about what to do with this information. I could have called her, could have told her the truth, could have offered her a chance to take back the divorce filing before it became public, but I didn't, because I realized something important. I needed to know who she really was when she thought I had nothing, needed to see what she'd choose when she believed the choice had no consequences, needed to understand whether our entire marriage had been real or just convenient for her ambitions. Patricia Winters cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Morrison, while I'm sympathetic to your personal situation, perhaps we should—" "In a moment," Daniel interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an authority he'd never known he possessed. "But first, I want Victoria to know something. The divorce papers are still on our kitchen counter, unsigned. I haven't rejected them, haven't contested them, haven't made any decisions about how to respond. But now she knows what signing them will cost her, not just me, not just our marriage, but whatever future she imagined building in this company under an owner who doesn't know about her betrayal." Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out choked and desperate. "Daniel, please. You don't understand. Brandon and I, we didn't mean for it to happen. It just, things got complicated. Things got complicated." Daniel repeated the words like examining a specimen. "That's an interesting way to describe a deliberate choice to betray your husband with his best friend while planning to divorce him for his poverty. But I suppose we all choose the narratives that help us sleep at night." He stood then, unable to maintain the sitting position any longer, needing movement to channel the energy coursing through him. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to leave this room and let you all continue with your meeting. Patricia, Richard will provide you with my contact information and instructions for the transition process, but I'm not making any immediate changes to operations or leadership. You've built something successful here, and I'm not interested in disrupting it out of personal spite, but I am going to learn this business thoroughly over the next few months, and I am going to make decisions about the future based on merit and performance and whether the people in this company are aligned with the values I want to represent." He finally looked away from Victoria, meeting the eyes of the other board members in turn. For those of you who've worked with Victoria, who respect her professionally, who might be concerned about her position here, understand that my personal life and business decisions are separate categories. What she did to me as my wife has no bearing on her capabilities as an executive, but what she chooses to do in the next few days, how she handles this situation, whether she demonstrates integrity or self-serving manipulation, will absolutely inform my decisions about her future with this company. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that felt violent in the quiet room. "You're enjoying this. You're punishing me for leaving you by humiliating me in front of my colleagues. This is abuse, Daniel. This is— Stop." The word came out harder than Daniel intended, sharp enough to cut through Victoria's building hysteria. "I'm not punishing you, Victoria. I'm simply existing in a reality where the consequences of choices become visible. You chose to divorce me when you thought I was worthless. You chose to betray me with Brandon when you thought I'd never have power over your life. You chose cruelty over kindness, ambition over loyalty, and now you're facing a world where those choices matter. But I'm not the villain here. I'm just the warehouse worker who inherited $1 trillion and a front row seat to my wife's character reveal." He walked toward the door, each step feeling like wading through concrete, but Richard was there to guide him out, back to the adjacent office where he could finally breathe without 47 pairs of eyes watching his every reaction. Through the one-way glass, Daniel watched as the conference room erupted into controlled chaos. Board members whispering urgently to each other, Patricia trying to restore order, Victoria sitting back down with her head in her hands, while a colleague tried to offer comfort. But the damage was done, the revelation complete, the carefully constructed life Victoria had built, now balanced on the knife edge of Daniel's mercy or lack thereof. "How do you feel?" Richard asked quietly, closing the door to give them privacy. Daniel considered the question seriously, taking inventory of his emotional state. Hollow, satisfied and hollow at the same time. Is that normal? Perfectly normal. Richard's hand landed on his shoulder, solid and grounding. Revenge always feels better in anticipation than in execution. The question is what you do next, how you move forward now that you've had your moment of revelation. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I thought seeing her face would give me answers, would clarify whether I wanted to destroy her career or show her mercy, whether I should sign the divorce papers or fight for a marriage that's clearly dead. But I just feel tired. So incredibly tired." "Then rest." Richard handed him a bottle of water from the small office refrigerator. "Go back to the hotel or go to one of your properties outside the city or go anywhere that isn't here. Give yourself time to process what just happened before making decisions about what comes next. But remember, you control the timeline now. Nobody can force you to move faster than you're ready." Daniel nodded but didn't move, couldn't quite tear himself away from the window overlooking the conference room where his wife— was she still his wife? The papers weren't signed yet, sat with her career and her reputation and her future in ruins. And despite everything she'd done, despite all the cruelty and betrayal, part of him still hurt for her pain. "She's going to try to talk to you," Richard warned, "probably within the hour. She'll call, text, maybe even show up wherever you're staying. You need to decide now whether you want to engage with that or maintain distance until you've processed your feelings." "Distance," Daniel said immediately. "Block her number, have security at the hotel refuse her entry. I can't talk to her right now. Maybe not for a long time, but definitely not today." Richard nodded approval. Smart choice. "And Brandon, he'll find out soon. Victoria will tell him, or the story will spread through social circles, and he might reach out as well." The mention of Brandon ignited something in Daniel's chest, a flash of anger that burned hotter and cleaner than anything he'd felt about Victoria, because Brandon's betrayal felt different somehow, felt more calculated, felt like friendship weaponized into cruelty. Brandon lives in a building I own, his apartment, his parking space, his address that he thinks makes him successful. It's all mine. What happens if I decide I don't want to rent to him anymore? Legally, you'd need to provide proper notice and justification under Washington tenant protection laws, but the building management works for you, ultimately, and there are usually ways to encourage voluntary departures if you're determined. But Daniel, Richard's voice took on a warning tone. Using your wealth to make someone's life miserable is a path that leads nowhere good. You'll feel powerful in the moment, feel like you're righting wrongs, but it corrupts you from the inside out, turns you into someone you don't recognize. So I just let him get away with it? Let him keep living his comfortable life in my building while he celebrates stealing my wife? No, Richard said firmly. You let the natural consequences unfold without adding artificial cruelty. Brandon will lose Victoria's income when her position here becomes untenable, or when she's too ashamed to continue. He'll lose the social cachet of dating a successful executive. He'll lose whatever fantasy they built together about their superior relationship and their justified betrayal. Reality will punish them far more effectively than any action you could take. But if you actively try to destroy them, you'll become the villain in their story. Give them someone to blame other than themselves. Give them a way to rewrite history where they're the victims. The wisdom in Richard's words was undeniable, but accepting it felt like swallowing broken glass, felt like choosing passivity over justice, felt like the same old Daniel Morrison who'd always been too weak to fight back. I don't want to be weak anymore, Richard. I don't want to be the guy who just takes it, who turns the other cheek, who lets people hurt him without consequences. There's a difference between strength and vengeance, between consequences and cruelty, between justice and revenge. Richard turned Daniel away from the window, forced eye contact that felt like being seen all the way through. The strong man doesn't need to prove his strength by destroying those weaker than him. The powerful man doesn't need to flaunt his power to feel validated. Your father learned this too late. He spent decades using his wealth as a weapon, and it cost him relationships, peace, happiness, everything that money can't buy, but he hoped you'd be better than him. Wiser than him, would use this inheritance to build something meaningful rather than just satisfy wounds. Daniel pulled away, walked to the office's exterior window, where he could see Seattle spread out below, like a kingdom he'd inherited, but didn't know how to rule. What if I'm not that person? What if I'm just a hurt, angry man who wants everyone who wronged him to suffer? Then you'll suffer most of all, Richard said simply. Hurt people, Daniel, and the cycle never ends unless someone chooses to break it. But that doesn't mean you have to be friends with Victoria and Brandon. It doesn't mean you pretend the betrayal didn't happen. It just means you don't let their choices define who you become. Don't let their cruelty make you cruel. The office door opened suddenly, and a young woman in a corporate blazer stuck her head in with obvious anxiety. Mr. Ashford, Ms. Hartley, is asking to speak with Mr. Morrison privately. She says it's urgent. Tell her no, Daniel said before Richard could answer. Tell her I'm not available, won't be available today, and any communication should go through Mr. Ashford's office. The woman nodded and retreated, but the damage was done. The knowledge that Victoria was already in crisis management mode, already trying to control the narrative, already working to salvage what she could from the wreckage of her choices. Daniel's phone began buzzing in his pocket, call after call that he let go to voicemail, texts that piled up with increasing desperation, Victoria's panic bleeding through each message that he refused to read. But Richard was right. Engaging now, responding to her fear and manipulation, would only prolong the pain and cloud his judgment. "Take me somewhere else," Daniel told Richard. "Anywhere that isn't here, anywhere I don't have to think about Victoria or Brandon or any of this for a few hours. I just need space, silence, time." Richard made a call, spoke in low tones to someone on the other end, then turned back to Daniel with a small smile. "You own a private island in the San Juan archipelago, about 2 hours north by helicopter. There's a house there, fully staffed, but they can make themselves scarce, and nobody will bother you unless you explicitly request it. But we should leave now before Victoria manufactures some emergency that complicates your departure." The idea of an island, of literal physical distance from the chaos of his collapsing marriage and bewildering inheritance, felt like permission to breathe for the first time in days. But as they took the private elevator down to the parking garage, as they drove to Boeing Field, where a helicopter was apparently waiting to take Daniel to a private island he owned but had never heard of, part of him wondered if running away was any different from the passive acceptance he'd practiced his entire life. The helicopter ride over Puget Sound was surreal. Daniel had never been in a helicopter before, had never seen Seattle from this angle, had never experienced the strange combination of power and vulnerability that came from being suspended in the air by nothing but machinery and physics. But the pilot maintained professional distance, allowing Daniel to process his thoughts without the burden of small talk. The island emerged from the afternoon mist like something from a dream, approximately 40 acres of forested coastline, rocky beaches, and a surprisingly modern house that somehow blended into the landscape without dominating it. And as the helicopter touched down on the property's pad, Daniel felt something in his chest unclench slightly, felt the possibility of breathing without the weight of 47 curious stares or Victoria's desperate texts or Brandon's inevitable attempts at explanation. The house staff introduced themselves briefly, a groundskeeper, a housekeeper, a private chef, but Richard had instructed them to give Daniel space, and they retreated to quarters separate from the main house, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and the sound of waves against rocks and the weight of decisions he still needed to make. He spent that afternoon walking the island's perimeter, his expensive suit abandoned for jeans and a sweater he found in the house's wardrobe, his Italian leather shoes replaced by hiking boots that fit perfectly because apparently someone had researched his size and stocked the island with appropriate clothing. The isolation should have felt lonely, but instead it felt clarifying, stripping away all the noise and pressure and expectation to reveal the core question. Who did Daniel Morrison want to be with this power? Did he want to be Jonathan Pierce, brilliant and strategic but ultimately alone, his wealth a barrier rather than a bridge to genuine connection? Did he want to be vengeful Daniel, using his resources to punish those who'd hurt him, proving his worth through the suffering of those who'd dismissed him? Or could he be something else entirely, someone who acknowledged the hurt but chose growth over revenge? Someone who used this inheritance to build rather than destroy. Someone who proved his worth not through Victoria's regret, but through his own evolution. Night fell over the island, and Daniel sat on the deck of a house he owned, but didn't yet feel he deserved, watching stars appear in a sky unpolluted by city lights, feeling the weight of his father's letter in his pocket like a compass, pointing toward destinations he couldn't yet see. His phone had stopped buzzing hours ago. Either Victoria had given up or Richard had implemented the number blocking as requested, but the silence was both relief and terror, because without the constant demands and chaos, Daniel had to face himself, had to confront the man he'd been and the man he might become. He pulled out Jonathan's letter again, reading it by the light of his phone, paying attention to different phrases this time. Power without purpose becomes poison. Be better than I was. You can destroy them both, Daniel, and part of me hopes you will, but I also hope you'll consider whether destruction is what you really want. The words felt like a test, like Jonathan had known exactly what circumstances would greet his son, had anticipated the betrayal and the hurt and the temptation toward revenge, had structured his final message as a guide toward some better path that Daniel couldn't quite visualize yet. Around midnight, Richard called to check in, his voice careful and concerned. "How are you doing?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I keep cycling through every possible response, signing the divorce papers, contesting them, firing Victoria, protecting her job, destroying Brandon's life, ignoring him completely, and none of them feel right. None of them feel like they lead anywhere good." "That's because you're trying to find a decision that makes everything make sense, that provides closure or justice or some clear resolution, but life doesn't work that way. Sometimes the best choice is just the least bad option, the path that keeps the most doors open while you figure out who you want to become." "What would you do?" Daniel asked. "If you were me, if your wife betrayed you and you suddenly had all this power, what would you do?" There was a long pause, and Daniel could hear Richard breathing slowly, considering his answer carefully. "I'd probably burn it all down, use every resource to destroy everyone who'd hurt me, and then spend the rest of my life regretting that I'd become the villain in my own story. But that's exactly why I'm not the right person to answer this question, Daniel. You need to find your own path, make your own mistakes, become your own version of powerful, rather than trying to follow someone else's template." "That's not very helpful," Daniel said, but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion and a strange fondness for this lawyer who'd upended his entire world. "No, but it's honest. And honesty is what you need right now. Not comfort or guidance or someone telling you what to do, but I will tell you this. Whatever you decide about Victoria, about Brandon, about your future, make sure you can live with yourself 5 years from now. Make sure the man you become is someone you respect, someone who makes choices based on values rather than wounds, someone who uses power to build rather than destroy." After the call ended, Daniel sat in darkness listening to waves and trying to imagine that future self, 5 years older, wiser, transformed by wealth but not corrupted by it, and what he saw was someone who'd used his inheritance to create something meaningful, something that honored Jonathan's memory while also redeeming Daniel's own story. But he also saw the scars that would remain, the betrayal that would always be part of his history, the marriage that had died not in a dramatic explosion but in 1,000 small cruelties that accumulated into terminal damage, and he knew that some wounds never fully healed, could only be integrated into the larger story of who you chose to become. Tuesday came faster than Daniel wanted, arriving with a phone call from Richard that carried news Daniel had been both expecting and dreading. "Victoria submitted her resignation this morning, effective immediately. She's claiming personal reasons and requesting all remaining PTO and severance be processed according to her contract." "Did I do that?" Daniel asked. "Did showing up to that meeting destroy her career?" "You revealed consequences," Richard corrected gently. "Victoria destroyed her own career through choices she made long before she knew about your inheritance. But yes, your presence made those consequences visible in a way she couldn't ignore or manage." Daniel stared out at the water, watching ferry boats trace their routes across Puget Sound. "What about Brandon? Has he reached out?" "Multiple times. He's left 17 messages with my office, sent dozens of emails to addresses he found online. And according to building security, he attempted to enter the island property twice before being turned away. He claims he needs to explain, needs Daniel to understand that the affair was Victoria's idea, that he was manipulated, that he's the real victim in all of this. The attempt to rewrite history, to shift blame, to position himself as somehow innocent, despite his active participation in betrayal, sparked something in Daniel that felt like clarity cutting through fog. "Send him a message. Tell him I'm willing to meet. but it has to be on my terms, at a location I choose, with no drama or public scenes. And if he agrees, tell him to be at the Morrison Logistics warehouse at 6 p.m. Friday. Tell him to ask for Tommy Chen and say Daniel sent him." There was surprise in Richard's voice. "The warehouse? Your old job? Are you sure that's wise?" "Probably not," Daniel admitted, "but it feels right. I need to see who Brandon is when he's on my territory, in the place where I used to be nothing, in front of people who knew me as just Daniel, not as the secret trillionaire's heir. I need to see if he has any honor at all, any ability to own his choices, or if he's just another person who saw me as an opportunity to exploit." "And Victoria? Will you see her?" Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 7 years press against his chest. "Not yet, maybe not ever. Right now, she represents everything I failed to see about myself. How I accepted cruelty as normal, how I sacrificed myself for someone who never valued that sacrifice, how I confused love with convenience and loyalty with cowardice. But I don't want to destroy her, Richard. Despite everything, I don't want to be the reason she loses everything. Just let her go. Process her resignation, give her the severance she's owed, and let her figure out her own path forward. That's mercy she doesn't deserve." "Maybe not," Daniel agreed. "But it's the mercy that lets me sleep at night, that keeps me from becoming someone who uses power as a weapon, that honors the man I want to be rather than the man my hurt would make me become." The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Daniel split his time between the island and the downtown hotel, began preliminary meetings with the corporate team to understand the breadth of his holdings, started therapy with a counselor who specialized in sudden wealth trauma, and slowly, painfully, began accepting that his old life was gone forever, that Daniel Morrison, the warehouse worker, had died the moment Richard Ashford walked into that conference room. Friday arrived with Pacific Northwest rain that felt appropriate for the confrontation Daniel had been dreading, and he arrived at Morrison Logistics at 5:30 p.m., early enough to talk with Tommy Chen and the evening shift crew before Brandon showed up. "Danny!" Tommy's face lit up with genuine pleasure, though confusion quickly followed. "What are you doing here? Thought you'd moved on to better things." "Better is relative," Daniel said with a small smile. "But yeah, my life has gotten complicated, in ways I'm still processing. But I need a favor, Tommy. I have someone coming here at 6, my ex-best friend, the guy who's been sleeping with Victoria. He thinks he's coming to explain himself, to make excuses, to manipulate me into forgiveness. But I want him to meet the people who actually know me, who saw me when I was at my lowest, who showed me respect when I had nothing worth respecting except character." Tommy's expression darkened. "You want us to teach him a lesson? Because the guys and we've got opinions about men who betray their brothers." "No violence," Daniel said firmly. "Just be yourselves. Show him what real loyalty looks like, what authentic friendship means. Let him see the difference between people who value you for who you are versus people who only care about what you can do for them." The evening crew gathered as Daniel explained the situation, carefully, without revealing his inheritance, but making clear that Brandon had chosen ambition over friendship, had prioritized Victoria's money and status over decades of brotherhood, and by 6 p.m., when Brandon's Tesla pulled into the warehouse parking lot, looking absurdly expensive against the backdrop of work trucks and aging sedans, Daniel had an audience of 17 warehouse workers who understood exactly what kind of man was about to walk through their doors. Brandon entered wearing a designer suit that probably cost 3 months of Daniel's old salary, his hair styled with products that smelled expensive, his entire bearing radiating confidence and condescension. But his expression faltered when he saw Daniel standing among the warehouse crew, like he belonged there, like he was choosing to be there rather than being trapped by circumstance. "Daniel." Brandon's voice carried artificial warmth, rehearsed sincerity, the tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation in the mirror. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know things have been complicated, but I think if we just talk honestly, you'll understand that this whole situation is more nuanced than you realize." "Nuanced," Daniel repeated, letting the word hang in the warehouse air that smelled of cardboard and motor oil. "That's an interesting word choice for deliberately sleeping with your best friend's wife while helping her plan to divorce him." Brandon glanced at the warehouse workers surrounding them, seeming to notice for the first time that this was going to be a public conversation. "Can we talk privately? This is between us, Daniel. We don't need an audience." "These men are my friends," Daniel said firmly. "They showed me more loyalty in 7 years of working together than you showed in 15 years of supposed brotherhood. So whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of them." Color rose in Brandon's cheeks, embarrassment or anger or both, but he pressed forward with his prepared speech. "Victoria and I didn't mean for it to happen, Danny. It just evolved. We'd see each other at your apartment when you were working overtime. We'd talk about our lives, our dreams, and we realized we had a connection that went beyond friendship. It wasn't about hurting you. It was about two people finding each other. While I was working overtime to pay rent on the apartment where you were seducing my wife," Daniel said flatly, "while I was sacrificing my time and energy so Victoria could pursue her career, while you were pretending to be my friend to my face and betraying me behind my back. Yeah, that sounds like a beautiful connection. Really romantic." Brandon's jaw tightened. "You're making this about betrayal when it's really about compatibility. Victoria needs someone on her level, someone who understands ambition, someone who can match her professionally and financially. You're a warehouse worker, Daniel. You were holding her back, limiting her potential, making her feel small. What we did freed her to become who she was meant to be." The words landed exactly as intended, designed to cut, to diminish, to justify betrayal through contempt. But Daniel felt something strange. Not hurt, not rage, but a cold clarity that recognized manipulation without being moved by it. "You're right," Daniel said quietly, and Brandon's expression shifted to surprise, clearly expecting more resistance. "I was a warehouse worker. I did make less money than Victoria. My apartment was small and shabby. My car was old, my clothes were cheap, my prospects were limited, but you know what else I was, Brandon? I was loyal. I was honest. I was faithful. I valued the people in my life for who they were rather than what they could do for me, and apparently those qualities mean nothing in your value system. Or don't act like you're some saint," Brandon snapped, his practiced control cracking. "You knew Victoria was unhappy. You knew she deserved better. You just refused to acknowledge it because you were comfortable with your mediocre life, comfortable holding her back, comfortable being the anchor around her neck." Tommy Chen stepped forward then, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen Daniel at his best and worst. "Man, you don't know what you're talking about. Danny worked doubles, covered shifts for people with sick kids, helped guys study for promotion exams, never complained, never acted like work was beneath him. He's got more character in his pinky than you've got in your whole body, and the fact that you can't see that, the fact that you measure a man's worth by his bank account rather than his actions, that tells me everything I need to know about why you'd betray him." Brandon turned his condescension on Tommy, clearly unused to being challenged by people he considered beneath him. "And you are?" "Someone who actually knows what friendship means," Tommy replied. "Someone who wouldn't stab a brother in the back for a woman or money or status. Someone who recognizes that Daniel was the best man in this whole story, and you and his wife were just users who couldn't appreciate what you had." Other workers murmured agreement, creating a wall of solidarity around Daniel that seemed to physically unsettle Brandon, whose confidence crumbled further with each passing moment. "This is ridiculous," Brandon said, turning back to Daniel with desperation creeping into his voice. "I came here to apologize, to explain. to see if we could find some way forward as friends. But clearly you've poisoned these people against me." "I didn't have to poison anyone," Daniel interrupted. "I just told them the truth. You did the rest yourself by showing up here in your expensive suit, looking down on honest workers, dismissing their opinions because they don't meet your standards of success. You revealed yourself, Brandon. I just provided the audience." Brandon's hands clenched into fists, his face flushing with anger that seemed dangerously close to violence. "You think you're better than me? You think working in this dump with these people makes you superior? You're nothing, Daniel. You've always been nothing." At least Victoria had the sense to recognize that before wasting more of her life on your mediocrity. The words should have hurt, would have devastated Daniel a week ago, but now they just felt like confirmation of everything he'd come to understand about Brandon's character, that beneath the charm and friendship and shared history was someone fundamentally hollow, someone who measured worth in dollars and status and power, but who possessed none of the qualities that actually mattered. "You're right again," Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge that made Brandon pause. "I am nothing, just a warehouse worker with no prospects, no future, no value beyond my labor, but you know what makes me smile, Brandon? Knowing that you destroyed a 15-year friendship for Victoria, ambitious, status-conscious Victoria, who just lost her 6-figure job at Pierce Global Enterprises and is currently scrambling to find new employment in an industry that's heard about her catastrophic flameout. You traded our brotherhood for a woman who's about to discover that she needs you for financial support rather than the other way around. How's that going to work out for your ego?" Brandon's face went pale. "Victoria didn't lose her job. She resigned. She said it was her choice. She resigned because staying became impossible after the new owner showed up at the board meeting and revealed that he was her soon-to-be ex-husband who she'd been mocking for his poverty while sleeping with his best friend. She resigned because every colleague in that room now knows exactly who she is, what she values, how she treats people when she thinks they're beneath her. But sure, tell yourself it was her choice if that helps you sleep." "You did that?" Brandon's voice rose toward hysteria. "You showed up at her workplace and humiliated her. That's abuse, Daniel. That's using power to hurt someone who hurt me first," Daniel finished. "Yeah, it is. It's consequences. It's reality. It's what happens when you burn bridges without checking whether you might need them someday. But I didn't fire her, Brandon. I didn't even speak to her directly. I just existed in a space where my existence revealed her choices for what they were, and she couldn't handle the exposure." Brandon was breathing hard now, his composure completely gone, his careful manipulation replaced by raw panic. "This isn't over, Daniel. Victoria and we're still together. We love each other. We're going to get through this, and when we do, when she finds an even better job, when I get my promotion, we're going to look back on this and laugh about how you tried to break us." "Maybe you will," Daniel said with something that might have been pity. "Maybe love conquers all. Maybe your relationship will survive the loss of Victoria's income and status. Maybe you'll both look back fondly on the time you betrayed someone who trusted you. But Brandon, I really, genuinely hope you're right. I hope you two are happy together, because if you're not, if this all falls apart and you realize you destroyed a lifelong friendship for nothing, then you'll have to live with that choice forever." He turned away then, dismissing Brandon with the same casual contempt Brandon had shown him countless times, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching, the former victim taking power not through violence or vengeance, but through simple disengagement, through refusing to allow Brandon's narrative to define him. "Wait," Brandon called out desperately. "Daniel, wait. I need to know. Are you going to do something to me? Use whatever power you have to ruin my life? Because if this is about revenge—" Daniel looked back over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "No revenge, Brandon. No dramatic punishment or orchestrated destruction. You're going to face exactly the consequences your choices naturally create. No more and no less. But here's something you should know. That building you're so proud of living in, that penthouse you use to impress women and business contacts, that address that makes you feel successful, you're going to want to start looking for a new place to live. The building was sold to a new owner who's implementing a major renovation, and all current tenants are being offered buyouts to vacate by the end of next month. You'll get a generous relocation package, more than fair market value, but you'll need to find somewhere else to call home. The lie came easily, felt justified in a way that bypassed Daniel's usual commitment to honesty. But he saw Richard's advice clearly now. Let natural consequences unfold without adding artificial cruelty, but nudge circumstances just enough to ensure those consequences were felt. Brandon's face went through several shades of panic as he processed the implications. That's my home. I can't just... The market right now is insane. I can't afford... You'll figure it out, Daniel said with finality. You're ambitious, successful, operating on a level I could never reach. I'm sure finding affordable housing in Seattle will be easy for someone of your caliber. He walked away then, surrounded by the warehouse crew who clapped him on the back and murmured approval, leaving Brandon standing alone in a workspace that represented everything he looked down on, but which had just delivered a masterclass in loyalty, dignity, and the difference between having power and wielding it cruelly. In the parking lot, away from Brandon's hearing, Tommy Chen pulled Daniel aside with concern etched deep in his features. That thing about his building, is that true? Or were you just messing with his head? Daniel met Tommy's eyes, saw the hope there that he'd been justified rather than vindictive, saw a man looking for proof that good people could win without becoming bad people. Half true. I do own his building as of 4 days ago, and I am implementing renovations that will require temporary tenant relocation, but I haven't decided yet whether to make those relocations permanent or just long enough to make a point, and I don't know which choice makes me the better man. The better man gives him a chance to be better, Tommy said simply. Doesn't mean you have to make it easy, doesn't mean you pretend nothing happened, but it means you don't use your power to destroy him just because you can. That's what separates you from people like Brandon. You've got power now, but you're still asking whether using it is right, and he never asked that question in his life. The wisdom hit Daniel like a physical blow, because Tommy was right. The very fact that he was questioning his choices, weighing consequences, considering whether revenge was worth the cost to his own soul, that made him fundamentally different from Brandon and Victoria, who'd acted without concern for anyone but themselves. Thank you, Daniel said quietly, for today, for your friendship, for reminding me who I want to be. Anytime, brother. Tommy's handshake turned into a hug. And listen, I don't know what happened in your life this week, don't need to know the details, but whatever it is, you remember something. The man you were when you worked here, the guy who covered my shift when my daughter was born, who helped rookie workers learn the ropes, who never acted like labor was beneath him. That guy was already worthy of respect and loyalty. Money doesn't change that. Power doesn't change that. You're still Danny Morrison, and that's enough. The words broke something in Daniel's chest, released tears he'd been holding back for a week, for a year, for a lifetime of being told he wasn't enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't valuable, except for what he could provide to others. He cried in the parking lot of Morrison Logistics, while warehouse workers tactfully pretended not to notice, cried for the marriage that had died of neglect and cruelty, cried for the friendship that had been a lie, cried for the father he'd never known who'd loved him enough to let him go, cried for the man he'd been and the man he was becoming and the terrifying gap between those two identities. When the tears finally subsided, when Daniel could breathe again without his chest hitching, he found Richard Ashford waiting beside a car he didn't recognize, patient and understanding in a way that suggested he'd known exactly how this confrontation would unfold. "How do you feel?" Richard asked, the same question from a week ago, but carrying different weight now. Lighter, Daniel admitted. Still hurt, still confused, still terrified of making wrong choices with this power, but lighter. More like myself somehow, even though myself is completely different than it was 10 days ago. That's growth, Richard said with approval. That's integration. You're not trying to be Jonathan Pierce or trying to stay warehouse worker Daniel. You're becoming something new, something that honors both but is limited by neither. They drove back to the hotel in comfortable silence, but as they pulled into the underground parking garage, Daniel's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered, and Victoria's voice, broken, desperate, stripped of all its usual confidence, poured through the speaker. Danielle, please. I know I don't deserve your time, don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to know something. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply, completely sorry for everything I did, everything I said, every way I made you feel small and worthless. But I was wrong. About you, about Brandon, about what matters. I threw away something real for something hollow, and I'm paying for that now. But I need you to know that I see it, that I understand what I lost, that if I could take back every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment I treated you like you were less than me, I would. Daniel closed his eyes, Victoria's pain washing over him in waves that felt both satisfying and nauseating. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know. Because I spent 7 years taking you for granted, and you deserve at least this acknowledgement, that you were always the better person, the better partner, the better human, but also because... Her voice broke completely. Because I'm pregnant, Daniel. I found out yesterday. It's yours. I took a test 3 weeks ago and ignored it because I was so focused on leaving you, on starting my new life with Brandon. But now I'm scared and alone, and the man I thought would support me through anything is telling me this complicates things, is suggesting maybe I shouldn't keep it, is revealing himself as someone who only wanted me when I was successful and unencumbered, and I don't know what to do. The words detonated in Daniel's consciousness like a bomb, scattering every thought and feeling in directions he couldn't track, because a baby, their baby, conceived probably in one of the last times they'd been intimate before Victoria emotionally checked out completely, changed everything and nothing simultaneously. You're sure it's mine? The question felt necessary but ugly, felt like becoming someone he didn't want to be. Positive. The timeline doesn't work for Brandon. We only actually slept together twice, both times in the last month, both times after I'd already decided to leave you. But this baby was conceived 7 weeks ago, back when I was still going through the motions of being your wife, still occasionally pretending we had a marriage worth saving. Daniel opened his car door, needed air, needed space, needed anything other than this confined metal box, while Victoria destroyed the fragile piece he'd started building. What do you want from me, Vic? I don't know, she admitted. Forgiveness I don't deserve. Support I have no right to ask for. Some indication that you don't hate me so much, that you'd abandon your own child just to punish me. But mostly, I think I just needed you to know that I'm suffering too, that consequences are real, that losing you wasn't the liberation I thought it would be, but rather the worst mistake of my life. Is Brandon there with you? A bitter laugh. Brandon told me this morning that he needs space to think about whether he's ready for the responsibility of someone else's child, whether our relationship can survive this complication, whether I'm really the woman he thought I was or just someone he wanted when she was successful. But the answer was clear in his eyes, Daniel. He's done. He wanted the fantasy of stealing you away, wanted to feel powerful by taking something you valued, but the reality of actually supporting me, actually committing to me, actually being there when things are hard, he's not capable of that. So you're calling me because Brandon failed you the way I apparently failed you for 7 years. The anger was there, sharp and justified, but under it was something more complicated, concern for the child who hadn't asked to be conceived into this mess, awareness that innocent life required protection regardless of the circumstances that created it. I'm calling because you're the father of my baby, and because despite everything I did to you, despite every way I betrayed and hurt you, you're still the person I trust most in this world to do the right thing. But I'm also calling because I'm alone and scared, and realizing that ambition and status and corporate success mean absolutely nothing when your whole world is falling apart, and the person you thought would catch you was just using you for his own ego. Daniel looked up at Richard, who'd been listening to the entire conversation with careful neutrality, and saw compassion there, but also caution. A warning not to let guilt or obligation push him into choices he wasn't ready to make. Victoria, I need time. I need to process this, need to figure out what it means for my life and your life and this baby's life, but I'm not going to make promises right now that I might not be able to keep. And I'm not going to pretend that your pregnancy erases what you did or obligates me to step back into a role of supporting you unconditionally. I understand, she whispered. I'm not asking you to take me back or forgive me or pretend we can just fix this. I'm asking you not to hate me so much that you forget we're going to be connected forever through this child. And I'm asking you to remember that I'm human, that I made terrible choices, but I'm facing terrible consequences, that I'm genuinely sorry, even if sorry isn't enough. I don't hate you, Daniel said, surprised to find it was true. I'm hurt, I'm angry, I'm betrayed, but I don't hate you. I think I'm starting to pity you, starting to see that you sabotaged something good because you couldn't recognize its value. And that's a tragedy, but it's your tragedy to live with, not mine. Thank you for that, at least. Victoria's voice carried a fragile acceptance. I'll let you go. I'll wait for you to decide how involved you want to be. I'll handle this pregnancy on my own if I have to, but Daniel, our baby deserves better than what we gave each other. Whatever else happens, please don't let our mistakes become their burden. She hung up before he could respond, leaving Daniel standing in the parking garage holding a phone that suddenly felt impossibly heavy, weighted with responsibilities he'd never imagined, complications that made his inheritance feel simple by comparison. Well, Richard said carefully, that's unexpected. That's one word for it. Daniel's laugh was slightly hysterical. Any advice from the wise estate attorney? Several pieces, actually. Richard guided Daniel back into the car, started driving somewhere, though Daniel couldn't focus enough to care where. First, get a paternity test. Victoria sounds sincere, but you need legal confirmation before making any binding decisions. Second, consult with a family law attorney. I have recommendations to understand your rights and obligations, regardless of your relationship status with Victoria. Third, and this is the most important piece, don't make any major decisions about your marriage or divorce until you've had at least a month to process everything that's happened. Shock and pregnancy and guilt are terrible foundations for good choices. A month might be too long, Daniel argued. Victoria needs to know whether I'm going to be involved, whether she can count on child support, whether... Victoria spent months betraying you and planning to leave you while enjoying your financial support, Richard interrupted firmly. She can wait 4 weeks for you to get your bearings, and if she can't, if she tries to pressure you into immediate decisions, then that tells you something important about whether she's actually changed or just strategically repositioning for her own benefit. The cynicism felt harsh but necessary, felt like the kind of perspective Daniel needed to hear, because his default was always to accommodate, always to sacrifice his own needs for others, always to let guilt and obligation override self-protection. They arrived at a nondescript building in Capitol Hill, and Richard led Daniel inside to what turned out to be a therapist's office, Dr. Melissa Chen, who specialized in sudden wealth trauma and family systems, and who apparently had been briefed to expect Daniel for an emergency session. I arranged this yesterday, Richard explained at Daniel's confused look. Had a feeling the Brandon confrontation might stir up emotions that needed professional processing, though I obviously couldn't have predicted the pregnancy announcement. But Melissa is excellent at helping people navigate complex situations without judgment. Daniel met with Dr. Chen for 2 hours, unpacking the week's events in a way that felt both exhausting and cathartic. And by the end of the session, he had a clearer sense of his own values, priorities, and the kind of father he wanted to become, regardless of his relationship status with Victoria. You're allowed to be hurt and still choose compassion, Dr. Chen said as they wrapped up. You're allowed to set boundaries and still provide support. You're allowed to end your marriage and still co-parent effectively. But what you're not allowed to do, what will destroy you if you try, is sacrifice yourself completely to atone for power you didn't ask for, or to prove you're not like the people who hurt you. Your worthiness isn't determined by how much you endure or how much you give. It's inherent, and it was there when you were a warehouse worker, and it's there now that you're a billionaire, and it'll be there when you're a father. The words settled into Daniel's chest like pieces of truth he'd been searching for, without knowing what questions to ask. And when he finally left Dr. Chen's office, when he climbed back into Richard's car and asked to return to the island for a few days of solitude and processing, he felt more solid somehow, more anchored in himself despite the chaos swirling around him. The next month unfolded in a series of small decisions that accumulated into a larger picture of who Daniel Morrison was becoming. He hired a family law attorney who explained Washington's community property laws, child support obligations, and custody arrangements with professional detachment that helped Daniel see the situation as a legal puzzle rather than an emotional minefield. He ordered a paternity test through his attorney, communicated with Victoria only through legal channels to establish boundaries, and resisted her attempts to have tearful phone calls or dramatic reconciliation conversations that would muddy already murky waters. He spent time with Tommy Chen and the warehouse crew, maintained friendships that reminded him where he'd come from and who he wanted to remain regardless of wealth, even as he began learning the intricacies of managing a corporate empire that employed hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. He continued therapy with Dr. Chen twice weekly, processing grief and betrayal and unexpected fatherhood with someone who understood that money solved some problems while creating others, and who never let him hide behind wealth or martyrdom. He read and reread Jonathan's letter, searching for wisdom in the words of a father who'd made terrible choices out of love, who'd tried to protect his son through absence, who'd hoped Daniel would be better than he'd been. And slowly, painfully, Daniel began to answer the question that had haunted him since Richard Ashford walked into that warehouse conference room. What kind of man did he want to be with this power? The answer emerged not as a dramatic revelation, but as a series of small choices. When Brandon's building renovation was completed, Daniel allowed all tenants except Brandon to return to their units, but maintained the emergency relocation for Brandon's penthouse specifically, not forever, just long enough to ensure Brandon understood that consequences were real, that actions had prices, that destroying a 15-year friendship wasn't cost-free. After 6 months, Daniel planned to offer him a new lease at market rate, a chance to return or move on as he chose. But first, he needed to sit with the discomfort of his choices. When Victoria's severance was processed, Daniel added an additional $100,000 anonymously through Richard's office with instructions that it was for prenatal care and initial baby expenses, a gesture Victoria would never know came from him, but which ensured his child would be cared for regardless of Victoria's employment situation. But he maintained radio silence otherwise, letting his lawyers handle all pregnancy-related communications until the paternity test confirmed what he already knew. The baby was his. When Pierce Global Enterprises held its next quarterly board meeting, Daniel attended in person and announced that Victoria's replacement would be selected through a rigorous search process that prioritized competence and character over personal connections, that the company culture would be audited for toxic behaviors that had been tolerated under previous leadership, and that profits would be important but not at the expense of treating employees, from C-suite executives to warehouse workers, with dignity and respect. And when Tommy Chen's daughter got accepted to college but worried about affording tuition, Daniel established a scholarship fund for children of Morrison Logistics workers that would cover full tuition, room and board at any state university, funded by a trust that would exist in perpetuity, supporting generations of warehouse workers' families, honoring the people who'd shown him loyalty when he had nothing else. 6 weeks after the divorce papers first appeared on his kitchen counter, Daniel finally signed them. Not because Victoria had pressured him, not because Brandon had left, not because the pregnancy complicated maintaining a marriage that was already dead, but because he'd done the work to understand that loving someone didn't obligate him to stay with them, that ending a relationship wasn't the same as failing at commitment, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was acknowledge when love had transformed into something toxic that needed to end. Victoria called him after receiving the signed papers, her voice small and grateful. "Thank you for making this easy. Thank you for not dragging it out or punishing me through the legal process. I know I don't deserve your kindness." "This isn't kindness," Daniel corrected gently. "It's closure. We both need to move forward, both need to become the parents this baby deserves, both need to figure out who we are, separately before we can figure out how to co-parent together." "Are you dating?" The question came out vulnerably, stripped of judgment. "Have you found someone who appreciates you the way I should have?" "No," Daniel admitted. "I'm focusing on becoming someone I can respect, someone whose choices I'm proud of, someone who uses power wisely rather than vindictively. Dating feels premature when I'm still figuring out basic questions about my identity and values." "You're going to make someone very happy someday," Victoria said quietly. "Someone smarter than I was, someone who recognizes your worth before it's too late. I hope they appreciate what they have." The conversation ended there, cordial but distant, former spouses navigating the strange territory between intimate knowledge and permanent separation. But Daniel felt something like peace afterward, like he'd honored both his hurt and his values without sacrificing one for the other. The baby, a girl, according to the ultrasound Victoria shared through their lawyers, was born on a cold February morning, 8 months after Daniel's inheritance, 7 months after the divorce finalized, 6 months after Daniel moved into a modest house in Ballard that balanced comfort with humility, that proclaimed wealth without ostentation, that felt like home in a way his old apartment never had. Daniel was there for the birth, held his daughter within minutes of her arrival, felt something shift in his chest that rendered all previous concerns about power and revenge and betrayal utterly insignificant compared to the weight of this tiny human who depended on him for everything. They named her Grace, Victoria's choice, but one Daniel approved, and in the months that followed, they built a co-parenting relationship that was cordial, if not warm, functional, if not friendly, focused entirely on Grace's well-being rather than their history of hurt. Brandon disappeared from Victoria's life completely, moved to Portland for a new job opportunity that conveniently removed him from any obligation to support or acknowledge the child his affair had helped create, and though part of Daniel wanted to feel vindicated by Brandon's cowardice, mostly he just felt sad for what had been lost and grateful for what remained. 5 years later, Daniel sat in the Morrison Logistics break room during his monthly visit to the warehouse, a tradition he'd maintained despite running a $1 trillion empire, because grounding himself in the place where he'd been, Daniel the warehouse worker reminded him who he wanted to be and watched Tommy Chen teach Grace to use the vending machine. Her delighted laughter as quarters clinked and candy bars dropped, filling the space with pure joy. "She's got your smile," Tommy observed, "and your tendency to overthink every decision." She spent 5 minutes debating between Snickers and M&Ms like it was a Supreme Court case. Daniel laughed, feeling more at peace than he had in years. "Learned that from me, I guess, though I'm trying to teach her that some decisions don't require exhaustive analysis." "How's the co-parenting situation?" Tommy asked carefully. "Victoria treating you right these days?" "We're good. Respectful. She's remarried, actually. Met a teacher named David who seems genuinely kind. They're expecting their own child next spring, and Grace is excited about being a big sister, but Vic and we're never going to be friends. Too much history, too much hurt. But we can be effective partners in raising our daughter, and that's enough." "And Brandon?" Daniel shrugged. "Haven't spoken to him in 5 years. Heard through mutual acquaintances that he married someone wealthy, quit his job, and is living off his wife's family money in Sun Valley. But his story stopped being mine a long time ago. I hope he's happy, hope he learned something from his choices, but mostly I just don't think about him anymore." Grace ran over with her candy bar, climbing into Daniel's lap with the unself-conscious affection of a 5-year-old who knew she was loved. "Daddy, Tommy says you used to work here before you became the boss of everything. Is that true?" "It's true," Daniel confirmed. "I worked here for 7 years, and it taught me important things about friendship and loyalty and treating people with respect." "Were you poor, then?" Grace asked with childlike directness. Daniel glanced at Tommy, who was trying not to smile at the question only a child would ask. "I had less money then than I do now, but I wasn't poor in the ways that mattered. I had friends who cared about me, work that gave me purpose, and I learned that your worth isn't determined by your bank account, but by how you treat people when no one's watching." "Oh." Grace considered this seriously. "That's what Mommy says about you, too. She says you were always good, even when she wasn't, and that's why I'm lucky to have you as my daddy." The words, so casually delivered, hit Daniel with unexpected force, not because they represented forgiveness from Victoria, but because they represented truth finally acknowledged, consequences finally accepted, reality finally faced without evasion or excuse. Later that night, back in his Ballard house with Grace asleep in the bedroom he'd designed specifically for her overnight stays, Daniel pulled out Jonathan's letter one more time, reading the words that had guided him through 5 years of impossible choices. "Be better than I was. Be wiser than I could be." He thought about the man he'd been in that warehouse conference room, learning of an inheritance that would change everything. He thought about the choices he'd made, some wise, some vengeful, some compassionate, some strategic, that had brought him to this moment. He thought about Victoria's recognition, Brandon's absence, Tommy's friendship, Grace's pure love. And he realized that Jonathan had been right about power. It revealed character rather than created it, amplified existing qualities rather than transforming fundamental nature, tested whether you could maintain your values when nothing external forced you to. Daniel Morrison had become wealthy, powerful, influential, owner of hotels and real estate and corporations that touched millions of lives. But beneath all that accumulated power and responsibility, he remained essentially himself. A man who valued loyalty over profit, compassion over revenge, growth over stagnation, love over bitterness. The warehouse worker who'd been deemed worthless by his wife and betrayed by his best friend had discovered he was a trillionaire, but more importantly, he'd discovered he was enough, with or without the money, with or without the power, with or without anyone's validation or approval. And that discovery, that bone-deep knowing of his own worth, regardless of external circumstance, was the truest inheritance Jonathan Pierce had left his son. Not the $1 trillion, but the opportunity to prove to himself that he could have everything and still choose to be good. Daniel folded the letter carefully, returned it to the drawer where he kept precious things, and went to check on his sleeping daughter one more time before bed. Grace breathed softly in the dim light, one hand clutching a stuffed elephant Victoria had given her, the other reaching toward nothing as if grasping for dreams. "I'm going to be the father you deserve," Daniel whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "Not perfect, not always wise, not free from mistakes, but present and honest and committed to being better every day. That's the inheritance I want to give you. Not money, not power, but the knowledge that you're enough exactly as you are, and that love means showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Outside his window, Seattle glowed with familiar lights, the city where he'd been nothing and become everything, where he'd lost himself and found himself, where he'd learned that the measure of a man wasn't in his bank account, but in the choices he made when no one was forcing his hand. His phone buzzed with a message from Richard Ashford. "Board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. The Shanghai property deal needs your final approval. Also, there's someone I'd like you to meet afterward. Potential hire for the philanthropic division you've been developing. Her name is Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Tommy or Melissa, and her work in economic mobility programs is exceptional." Daniel smiled at the message, at the life he'd built that balanced corporate responsibility with personal values, that used wealth as a tool rather than a trophy, that honored both the warehouse worker he'd been and the business leader he'd become. He typed back, "I'll be there. And Richard, thank you for everything, for that first conversation in the warehouse office, for every piece of advice since, for understanding that I needed to figure out who I wanted to be rather than telling me who I should become." The response came immediately. "You did the work, Daniel. I just helped you see what was already there. Your father would be proud. I know I am." Daniel set down his phone and looked around his house. Tasteful but not ostentatious, comfortable but not excessive, filled with photos of Grace and Tommy's family and warehouse workers at the annual company picnic he'd instituted, pictures that told a story of connection rather than conquest, of relationships rather than acquisitions. On the mantel sat one photo that always drew his attention: himself and Victoria on their wedding day, young and hopeful and blissfully unaware of how their story would unfold. He'd kept it not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder that love wasn't always enough, that good intentions couldn't overcome fundamental incompatibilities, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was acknowledge when something beautiful had transformed into something broken. But beside that photo was a newer one. Grace on her first birthday, surrounded by her makeshift family, Victoria and her new husband David, Tommy Chen and his wife, Richard Ashford, looking surprisingly grandfatherly, several warehouse workers who'd become uncles in everything but name, all of them celebrating this child who'd been conceived in betrayal but born into love. That second photo told a different story, that endings created space for beginnings, that from ruins you could build something new, that the family you chose and cultivated mattered as much as the family you were born into. Daniel's thoughts drifted to Brandon, as they occasionally did in quiet moments. The last he'd heard, Brandon's marriage to the wealthy woman had ended badly. His Sun Valley lifestyle had collapsed when she'd discovered he was using her money to fund a gambling habit, and he was back in Seattle working a mid-level sales job and living in a studio apartment in Renton. Part of Daniel, the wounded part that remembered betrayal, felt a flicker of satisfaction at Brandon's downfall, but the larger part, the part that had grown through 5 years of conscious choices and therapy and fatherhood, just felt sad for a man who'd never learned that taking shortcuts always exacted a price, that authenticity mattered more than appearance, that real success was measured in relationships sustained rather than possessions accumulate. He'd thought about reaching out, about offering Brandon some kind of olive branch or opportunity for redemption, but Dr. Chen had been clear, Forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. Healing didn't obligate him to relationship. And some bridges were healthier, left burned because rebuilding them would only recreate toxic dynamics. Some people are in your life for a reason, some for a season, and some as a lesson, Dr. Chen had told him. Brandon was a lesson, a painful one but valuable. You learned what betrayal looks like, what superficial friendship costs, what happens when someone values you for what you provide rather than who you are. That's knowledge worth having, even if acquiring it hurt. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a gift from Richard, actually belonging to Jonathan Pierce's personal collection, chimed midnight, and Daniel realized he'd been lost in memories for over an hour. He needed sleep, needed to be sharp for tomorrow's board meeting, needed to meet this Dr. Sarah Chen, whose work apparently impressed Richard enough to warrant an introduction. He paused at that thought, examining his own reaction. 5 years ago, the idea of meeting a potential hire would have been business only, but Richard's phrasing had been careful, deliberate, the kind of wording that suggested this introduction might be personal as well as professional. Daniel hadn't dated since the divorce, not because he was still pining for Victoria, that particular wound had long since scarred over, but because he'd been focused on becoming someone whole, rather than looking for someone to complete him, on building a life that felt authentic rather than searching for external validation of his worth. But maybe 5 years was long enough to hide behind healing. Maybe Grace deserved to see her father model what healthy adult relationships looked like. Maybe Daniel deserved to discover whether he could trust someone new, open himself to vulnerability again, risk the pain that came with genuine connection. Or maybe Dr. Sarah Chen was just a professional contact, and Richard was trying to build the philanthropic division, and Daniel was reading too much into a simple text message because midnight made everyone philosophical and vulnerable. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, pausing at Grace's door to watch her sleep one more time, the ritual that bookended every day she spent in his house, and felt the weight of fatherhood settle over him like a familiar coat, heavy but comforting, restricting but purposeful. "I hope I'm doing this right," he whispered to the universe, to Jonathan's ghost, to his own uncertain heart. "I hope 5 years from now, 10 years, 20 years, you'll look back on your childhood and feel loved, feel secure, feel like your father made good choices even when they were hard. I hope you'll understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from something toxic, and sometimes the bravest thing is staying present for someone who needs you, and wisdom is knowing which situation requires which response." Grace stirred in her sleep, mumbled something that sounded like, "Daddy," and Daniel's heart clenched with the fierce, protective love that had
leave. America had given her more than food and shelter. It had given her a mirror to see what her country could become again. And as the sun set over the Texas hills, she whispered into the golden air, "They taught us how to live." The heat lingered long after sunset that May evening, soft and golden, the kind of warmth that seemed to hold the air still. Camp Swift had never looked so alive. The wide field near the mess hall had been transformed. Rows of long wooden tables stretched beneath strings of electric bulbs that glowed like captured stars. The townspeople from Bastrop had come in their Sunday best, their children darting between the benches with shouts of laughter, chasing fireflies that blinked and vanished in the dusky air. The smell of barbecue, smoke, and freshly baked bread drifted over the crowd, mingling with the sound of fiddles and laughter. For one night, there were no Germans and no Americans, no victors or defeated, only people who had shared something rare and unspoken. Helene stood near the edge of the gathering, her cotton dress fluttering in the faint breeze, a borrowed shawl draped over her shoulders. She watched as Clara Whittaker moved from table to table, making sure everyone had enough to eat, her face flushed with joy. Samuel stood nearby, a plate in one hand and his ever-present hat in the other, greeting people with the quiet ease of a man who had worked his whole life under the sun. The women from the camp sat together at one long table, their laughter tentative but genuine, like music learned again after years of silence. Helene could hardly reconcile this evening with the woman she had been when she arrived in Texas. Thin, frightened, her eyes trained on the ground. Back then she'd believed that kindness was a trick, that mercy was weakness, that every hand extended toward her must carry a hidden blade. Yet tonight, as she looked at the faces around her, at Clara's warm smile, at the small boy offering her a slice of pie, she understood what had happened here. They had not just survived the war, they had been taught how to live again. The sky darkened to indigo, and the electric bulbs flickered brighter against the rising stars. Someone began to play a slow tune on a guitar, and the hum of conversation softened to a hush. Samuel Whitaker stood, wiping his hands on a handkerchief before raising his glass. "To peace," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the field. "To the women who came here scared, and to the ones who are leaving as friends." The crowd lifted their glasses, some with wine, others with sweet tea. "To peace," they echoed. The sound rolled through the night like a blessing. Helene felt her throat tighten, her vision blur. The tears came not from sadness, but from something deeper, a gratitude too vast to name. She looked at Samuel and Clara, at the people who had turned enemies into neighbors, and she realized she had witnessed something greater than
words that the measure of success isn't how much you accumulate, but how much you lift up others in the process of building your own life. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Chen, no longer just a professional contact, but his wife of 3 years, stepmother to Grace, mother to their 2-year-old son Jonathan, squeezed his hand with pride evident in her touch. "She's remarkable, Daniel. She gets that from you, you know, the ability to see wealth as a tool rather than a trophy." "She gets it from watching you," Daniel countered, "from seeing how you built economic mobility programs that actually work, that treat people with dignity while providing genuine pathways out of poverty. She's seen us both model what it means to use privilege responsibly." Tommy Chen appeared from the crowd, older now but still solid, still real, still the friend who'd known Daniel when he was nothing and treated him exactly the same now that he was everything. "Your kid's making me cry, brother. She's talking about the Warehouse Workers Scholarship Fund, about how education changed her life by changing mine, about how opportunity cascades through generations when people commit to breaking cycles." "She's not wrong," Daniel said quietly. "Your daughter graduated medical school last year. Your son is studying engineering at MIT. That's not just about scholarship money. It's about what happens when people feel valued, when they know their work matters beyond a paycheck, when someone believes in their potential." The speech concluded to standing ovation, and Grace navigated the crowd with practiced ease, comfortable in spaces of power because she'd been raised to understand that power was neutral. It became good or evil based on how you wielded it, who you served with it, what you built with it. Later that night, after the gala ended, after Grace went home with Victoria and David for her scheduled week at their house, after Sarah put young Jonathan to bed, Daniel found himself in his study looking at the letter from his biological father that he'd read hundreds of times over 15 years. "Be better than I was." He'd tried. God knew he'd tried. He'd built affordable housing developments in 17 countries. He'd funded scholarships for thousands of working-class students. He'd transformed Pierce Global Enterprises from a pure profit machine into a certified B Corporation that balanced shareholder returns with stakeholder welfare. He'd maintained friendships with warehouse workers even as he sat on corporate boards. He'd co-parented with grace and compassion despite the hurt that had preceded Grace's birth. He'd married someone who shared his values and built a life focused on meaning rather than opulence. But he'd also made mistakes. He'd been petty with Brandon in ways that took years to recognize and acknowledge. He'd sometimes confused philanthropy with penance, giving away money to atone for, having it rather than strategically deploying resources for maximum impact. He'd struggled to accept that his daughter would face challenges he couldn't solve with wealth or power or connections. "You're thinking about Jonathan again," Sarah said from the doorway, reading him with the accuracy that came from genuine intimacy. The father you never knew but who shaped everything about your life. I'm thinking about choices, Daniel admitted. About how one decision 15 years ago to reveal myself at that board meeting rather than handle things quietly created ripples that touched thousands of lives. Grace exists because of that choice. The foundation exists because of that choice. Even our marriage exists because Richard brought you to meet me after I'd spent 5 years, proving I could wield power without being corrupted by it. Sarah crossed the room, settled into his lap with comfortable familiarity. You know what I think? I think Jonathan Pierce made terrible choices as a father, but one brilliant choice as a dying man. He gave you wealth, yes, but more importantly, he gave you the choice of what to do with it. He didn't control you from the grave, didn't mandate how you had to spend or invest or give. He just trusted that the man you'd become, shaped by struggle, by warehouse work, by betrayal survived, would make wiser choices than he had. And did I, Daniel asked, make wise choices? You're still asking that question, Sarah observed gently, which means you're still checking yourself, still examining your motives, still ensuring that power serves purpose rather than ego. That's what wisdom looks like, Daniel. Not perfect knowledge, but constant questioning. Not avoiding mistakes, but learning from them. Not achieving some final state of enlightenment, but choosing growth every single day. Through the study window, Daniel could see Seattle's lights reflecting off Elliott Bay, the city that had witnessed his transformation from warehouse worker to billionaire, from betrayed husband to effective co-parent, from someone who'd been told he was worthless to someone who'd proven worth had nothing to do with net worth. Somewhere in this city, Victoria lived a quiet life as a teacher, having left corporate ambition behind after her remarriage and second child, having found peace in work that served rather than climbed, having apologized countless times for the cruelty of her younger self. Somewhere in this city, Brandon worked his mid-level sales job, attended AA meetings twice weekly, and lived a life of hard-won sobriety and humility that looked nothing like the triumphant future he'd envisioned 15 years ago when he'd stolen his best friend's wife. Somewhere in this city, Tommy Chen's grandchildren were being born into opportunities their grandfather never had, educated in schools funded by Daniel's foundation, growing up in neighborhoods, stabilized by affordable housing developments, benefiting from ripples of choices made years before their existence. And somewhere in this city, actually, in this house, in this study, in this moment, Daniel Morrison sat with his wife and realized that the question wasn't whether he'd made perfect choices, but whether he'd made choices he could live with, choices that honored both his values and his wounds, choices that used power to heal rather than harm. I'm grateful, Daniel said suddenly, for all of it. The betrayal that revealed truth, the inheritance that provided resources, the friends who stayed loyal, the daughter who teaches me daily what unconditional love looks like, the wife who chose me, knowing everything about my past and loving me not despite it, but including it, the father I never knew who loved me enough to let me go and wise enough to give me tools without instructions. Sarah kissed his forehead, understanding without needing explanation. That's called integration, beloved. That's what happens when you stop fighting your story and start owning it. The beautiful parts and the brutal parts, the triumphs and the tragedies, the moments you're proud of and the moments you'd do differently if you could. Do you think Grace will face what I faced? Daniel asked. Will inheriting wealth corrupt her the way it could have corrupted me? Grace is being raised differently than Jonathan's children were, Sarah reminded him. She knows struggle because you've made sure she volunteers at homeless shelters and works summer jobs despite not needing money. She knows betrayal because you've been honest about your past in age-appropriate ways. She knows resilience because she's watched you build something meaningful from ruins. She knows values because we model them daily rather than just preaching them. Will she face challenges? Absolutely. Will wealth complicate her life? Certainly. But she'll face those challenges with tools you never had: awareness, preparation, and parents who prioritize character over comfort. The clock struck midnight. Marking the 15th anniversary of the day, Richard Ashford walked into a warehouse conference room and changed everything, and Daniel felt the symbolic weight of that timing, the universe's reminder that transformation took time, that healing wasn't linear, that becoming someone worthy of power was a journey measured in years rather than moments. His phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "Dad, I know it's late, but I wanted you to know. I'm proud to be your daughter, not because of the money or the foundation or any of that stuff everyone sees, but because you're genuinely good, because you could have become bitter and cruel after what Mom and Brandon did, but you chose to become better instead. That's the inheritance I value most. Love you." Daniel read the message 3 times, tears blurring the words, because 15 years of choices had led to this moment. His daughter recognizing not his wealth or power or achievements, but his character, his resilience, his deliberate choice to be better rather than bitter. And he realized, finally, fully, completely, that he'd succeeded, not in being perfect, not in avoiding all mistakes, not in wielding power flawlessly, but in proving to himself and his daughter, and anyone watching, that inherited wealth didn't have to corrupt, that betrayal didn't have to embitter, that discovering you were a trillionaire could coexist with remembering you were once a warehouse worker who was loved for exactly who he was. "Thank you," Daniel whispered to Jonathan's ghost, to the universe, to his own younger self, who'd been so lost and hurt 15 years ago. "Thank you for the inheritance, but more importantly, thank you for trusting me with the choice of what to do with it. I hope I made you proud. I hope I made myself proud. I hope the next 15 years continue the work of using power wisely, loving courageously, and teaching others that wealth is responsibility rather than reward." Sarah pulled him to his feet, led him toward their bedroom where tomorrow's challenges would come soon enough. "You're not finished, Daniel Morrison. You're just getting started. There's still so much good you'll do, so many lives you'll touch, so many cycles you'll break. But tonight, right now, in this moment, you've earned rest, you've earned peace, you've earned the knowledge that you took an impossible situation and transformed it into something beautiful." And as Daniel fell asleep beside his wife, in the house he'd built that balanced comfort with humility, in the life he'd created that honored both where he'd been and where he was going, his last thought was simple, complete, true: I am enough. I always was. The money just gave me the platform to prove it to myself. Daniel's journey reflects a central question. When you gain enormous power, do you use it for revenge or for growth? His choice to pursue wisdom over vengeance, to build rather than destroy, to use wealth as a tool for service rather than domination, represents the kind of character development that transforms tragedy into triumph without requiring the villain's complete destruction. Sometimes the greatest revenge is becoming someone so grounded in their own worth that the betrayal of others becomes irrelevant to your happiness.